Well, yeah, just to give you a little background, I was raised a good Episcopalian, just like a lot of you were raised whatever Christianity, and I had a very profound born-again experience, and I mean that very sincerely. I mean, in fact, it was in Anoka, not too far from here, and I think it was about October the 1st, 1970. And I'll tell you, the tears flowed for several weeks. So this is not just some kind of mental thing. And one thing led to another, and I got involved in a charismatic church, and baptized in the Holy Spirit, spoke in tongues, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon I ended up as a business manager of this church. I had left my real estate business, which was quite successful. As a matter of fact, in those early years, I sold the St. Cloud Mall to a real estate investment trust in Cleveland, Ohio. So St. Cloud has a special meaning for me, at least in the sense that I made a nice commission on that sale. But in any case, one thing led to another, business manager, then teacher in the Bible school. We had a 2-year curriculum for younger people, 18, 20-year-olds. And I ended up starting a church called King Jesus Church in 1976. And I pastored that church for 10 years. And was involved in speaking at a number of Christian conferences in the United States, and Winnipeg, and Texas, and North Carolina, and then I think 3 trips to England and twice to the former Yugoslavia, and where else? Oh, well, I can't forget Africa. I did seminars for pastors in Africa. So I think I qualified as a pretty gung-ho, genuine, real Bible-believing believer. Not a hell and damnation type guy. Real emphasis was always on grace and mercy, because actually that was the message that brought me into the fold. And that was a sudden transaction, in the sense that, when you're born again, it's immediate. But to leave that was agony. And in 1986, I decided to take a sabbatical leave, and just to kind of get away from things, because I realized, things are not happening the way the Bible says they should happen, in terms of the way Jesus is supposed to intervene in the lives of believers and in my life. And so I took a sabbatical leave, and one thing led to another, and I began to realize, there are a few contradictions here, and I've never really looked at these things before, But I always knew in the back of my mind that, somehow, here's Matthew has Joseph and Mary and Jesus. Immediately after Jesus is born, they're fleeing to Egypt. Whereas Luke has Jesus born, and they wait 40 days for Mary's purification, and they wait there in Bethlehem, and then they go into Jerusalem, and everybody's happy, and they're celebrating, and there's no mention of Herod or slaughter of these innocent babies. And it just, it's amazing to me, as I think back on this. I still can't get over it. It took me a couple of years before I could even begin to articulate this very blatant and obvious contradiction. I mean, here's Matthew has Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fleeing to Egypt, and they're going there for a couple of years. And here's Luke. There's no Herod. They wait for Mary's purification. Then they go into Jerusalem. Then they go to Nazareth. And everybody lives, happily ever after. And there's something about religion that just grabs hold of a person's mind, and it so consumes them that you just can't contemplate the possibility of a contradiction, because you want to believe this. And it was an agonizing 3 or 4 years. I didn't become an atheist just overnight. I mean, it was several years where I finally had to wade through, well, okay, here's one contradiction, then, oh, well, okay, here's another one, and then here's another one, and before I knew it, oh, there's a dozen of them. And then before I know it, there was 20 or 30, and, jeez, there are contradictions and inconsistencies all over the place. And finally I began to realize this didn't come from a God in heaven who is an infinite God of infinite wisdom. This came from man writing this thing. So, in any case, we're here to talk tonight about the founding fathers of the United States. And as you know, there's a great move amongst fundamentalist Christians to convince everybody that America was founded as a Christian nation. And so, if you'll look on different websites, in fact, if you go on Google, you know, America founded Christian nation, you'll find some really great articles in there. And I found one article, or I found one website, which is a Christian website, and his evidence is the fact that, well, first of all, Christopher Columbus's personal log states that his purpose was to take the gospel of Jesus Christ to the heathen. That was in 1492. Well, if you know a little bit about Christopher Columbus, he didn't exactly show a whole lot of love and mercy to the heathen when he landed in America. And of course, you'll see other statements, whereas, for instance, the Charter of the Virginia Colonies specifically states, this is in 1606, to the glory of His Divine Majesty in propagating the Christian religion to such people as yet live in ignorance and in the true knowledge of the worship of God. So a lot of these settlers came across here, and they had every intention. They thought they were in the know, they thought they were right, and they were going to bring the gospel to all these unbelieving people. And you'll find the same thing with the Charter of Plymouth in 1620. You'll find the Mayflower Compact in 1620 for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. And you'll find the charters to Massachusetts and to New Hampshire and to Pennsylvania. They all state these kinds of things. And this is what the Christians put forth as, well, now this is the evidence that our founding fathers, wanting to have the United States or the America as a Christian nation. Well, these were not really our founding fathers. These were the people that came over here because they were fleeing persecution. And the interesting thing is that when you read about the history of the Christians in the early United States, they came over here and then they turned around and persecuted the very people who disagreed with them. And so, any case, we get on up to, when I talk about the founding fathers, really I'm talking about people like George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, and one in particular that doesn't get mentioned enough is Thomas Paine. And these were and Benjamin Franklin, of course. These were the people who really were the ones that laid the foundation that established the United States of America and the Constitution. Now you'll find, interestingly, as you do a little searching, you'll find that, and I have no doubt that this is true, it says 50 of the 55 people who were attending the Constitutional Convention, this is 1787, 50 of 55 were all members of Christian churches. So, the Constitution, as you know, was brought into being in 1787. So 50 of 55 men who framed the Constitution were the framers. They were members of Christian churches, and you can go on the internet and you can find there were Congregationalists, they were Methodists, they were Baptists, they were Anglicans, which are Episcopalians, and then as you search some more, you'll come across a website for a fellow named David Barton. David Barton is a self-appointed Christian historian, and he will give you quotations. For instance, he will give you a quote from which he claims to be from James Madison, in which he claims that James Madison said, "We have staked the whole future of American civilization not on the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves, to sustain ourselves, according to the 10 Commandments. David Barton is a notorious fabricator. He completely designs and makes up these statements. If you'll find that there's a, gee, I wish I'd have brought it with me. There's a wonderful book I recommend to you. It's called Liars for Jesus. The author's name is Chris Rhoda. And she goes into claim after claim after claim by people like David Barton and shows how these are just totally false. And Chris Rhoda shows in her book, Liars for Jesus, how there are numerous James Madison biographies that have searched and searched and searched everything he's ever written. And they can find nothing even remotely close to this statement that Barton claims that he made. But these are the kinds of things that people are being told to justify the idea that, well, our nation is based upon Judeo-Christian values. And so David Barton is somebody that you really want to be aware of. Of course, it should be obvious truth to you that we know that the United States is formed as a Christian nation because my Congresswoman, Michelle Bachmann, has declared it to be the truth. And of course, she never speaks anything except that which was absolutely factually based. But I did a little searching into the idea of, well, what if we were formed as a Christian nation? What if we were formed, do we really have Judeo-Christian values? So I began doing a little searching on, well, what are some of the Judeo-Christian values? And I began to realize, gosh, I don't know if I would really want to live in a nation with Judeo-Christian values. For instance, as an example, if we had a nation of Judeo-Christian values, Exodus 22:20 says, "You must kill those who worship another god. He who sacrifices to any god other than to the Lord alone shall be utterly destroyed." That's Exodus 22:20. And in Deuteronomy 13 it says, "Kill any friends or family that worship a god that is different from the one that you worship." And again in Deuteronomy 13 it says, "Kill all the inhabitants of any city where you find people that worship differently than you." Can you just imagine what it would be like if we had Judeo-Christian values that were actually enforced in this country? Deuteronomy 17, "Kill everyone that has a religious doctrine that's different from you." Or kill anyone who refuses to listen to the priests of God. Kill all the false prophets. I'm just, these are all picking out of various verses in the Bible. And then there's a wonderful verse in Mark where Jesus says, any house that doesn't receive Jesus' disciples, you're there to shake, the disciples are to shake the dust off their feet and go on. So, you can just imagine what a wonderful, friendly community we would have if we had Judeo-Christian values. And in 2 John 1:10, "Do not associate with non-Christians. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching," the teachings of the Apostle John, "do not receive them into your house." And in Romans 16:17, "Shun those who disagree with your religious dogma." And you kind of get the picture. Judeo-Christian values are not exactly real friendly. And not only are they not friendly, but you'd end up going around accusing everybody whose doctrines are different from you. For instance, in 1 John 2:22, you'd be going around, running around accusing people of being the Antichrist. And this kind of thing just goes on and on all through the Scriptures. So Judeo-Christian values are, I think, anything but values that are going to create a unity. If anything, they will create disunity and diversity. And I think it's perfectly well reflected in the fact that you've got something like 2,000 different Christian denominations. Why are they of different denominations? Because they can't agree on what the Bible says. And if you're in one denomination, you're right, and the other guys are all going to hell. So Judeo-Christian values are not something that we would like to embrace. So the founding fathers, they knew these things. They were not dummies. They were very observant. They were people who acknowledged these problems. They were well aware of European history. They were well aware of the fact that, you know, when Europe had the bubonic plagues, the clergy of that day said, well, this comes as a punishment for sin. God's bringing this. No mention of the fact that the bubonic plagues came because of sanitation problems. Sanitation, oh no, this comes from God. And of course, the Salem witch trials were famous for that. Those took place in 1692. Why? Because the Bible says in Exodus 22, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And so you have to go around and find out which of those women are witches, and they're all destroyed, either hung or burned at the stake or whatever. England, there's nobody that really has an accurate figure, but it's estimated anywhere from 20 to 50,000 women were burned at the stake because they were accused as witches. I mean, can you just imagine the horrors of having some preacher or some Christian, you know, coming and accusing you of being a witch, and how do you disprove it? And you're burned at the, I mean, the horrors of that kind of thing must have been just unbelievable. In 1772, in Boston, there was a Dr. Boylston who he inoculated his son against smallpox, and Reverend Massey said, "Well, inoculation is an encroachment in the prerogatives of Jehovah, whose right it is to wound and smite." So these, you know, the people of the United States of America were well aware as to these kinds of things. I mean, we sit here, and I see many of you shaking your head, and I'm shaking my head too, and I'm wondering, how could we ever have found ourselves in a situation like this? So when you come around to, well, what did the founding fathers actually think about Christianity? And of course, who is more prominent as a founding father than George Washington? George Washington was a man of extraordinary well, what's the word I want? He was very polite. He was very diplomatic. He visited just about every church you could think of to visit. And he made a few statements which reflect his views, but they are not statements that confirm any kind of a Christian belief. He said to the Baptist Church in Virginia in May of 1789, "Every man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinion ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience." So there's no doctrinal, demands that he is suggesting. He's just simply saying whatever the deity is of your own conscience. And this is typical of deists and the way that the deists of those days thought. We'll talk a little bit more a little later on what is a deist. Of all the animosities, George Washington said, that have existed among mankind, those which are caused by a difference of sentiments in religion appear to be the most inveterate and distressing. I was in hopes that the enlightened and liberal policy would at least have reconciled Christians of every denomination, so far that we should never again see the religious disputes carried to such a pitch as to endanger the peace of society. Now, this is George Washington's observation as to how Christians got along with each other and the impact that they had on society. Another quotation from George Washington. "If they are good workmen, they may be of Asia, Africa, or Europe. They may be Mohammedans, Jews, or Christians of any sect, or they may be atheists." What do you think about that? And then some quotations of people who observed George Washington. There's a Bishop White who says, "His behavior in church was always very serious and attentive. Keep in mind, George Washington was a vestryman in the Episcopal Church, and he attended various services of many different churches. And so this Bishop White is saying, who's an Anglican bishop, his behavior was always very serious and attentive, but as your letter seems to intend an inquiry on the point of kneeling during the service, I owe it to the truth to declare that I never saw him in such an attitude. He never prayed. He never took communion. His wife Martha was a fervent Anglican, but he never took communion himself. And as a matter of fact, you'll find in the biographies of Washington, when they offered communion, he got up and walked out. And one time he was reproved by the priest for doing it, and from that day on, George Washington never went back when they had communion. Another Reverend M.J. Savage says the pictures that represent him on his knees in the winter forest at Valley Forge. I bet you many of you have seen pictures of George Washington on his knees. Total caricatures, never happened. Washington, this Reverend Savage says, he wasn't like any of those Pharisees who was going to make his religious views known to anybody. He wasn't going to show off his religiosity. And, and then this one by Thomas Jefferson. Dr. Rush told me that when the clergy addressed George Washington on his departure from the government, it was observed in their consultation that he had never on any occasion said a word to the public which showed a belief in the Christian religion. And so they sought to force him at length to disclose publicly whether he was a Christian or not. And however, he observed, that is, Jefferson observed the old fox, referring to George Washington, the old fox was too cunning for them who were seeking to get him to acknowledge his Christian belief. He was too cunning for them. He answered every article of their address, particularly except that which he passed over without notice. So he just ignored the question. Another Episcopal priest said about George Washington, "Sir, this man was a deist." Now that comes from a Reverend Abercrombie. We should just clarify what is a deist, because people seem to have some problems with understanding a deist. A deist is simply a person who believes in a God who began this creation process, but does not intervene personally in the lives of people. And he leaves it up to you to operate by reason and function by reason to determine how you should behave. And he encourages integrity and honesty and truthfulness. But a deist does not believe in the divine inspiration of the Bible. A deist does not believe in the virgin birth. A deist does not believe in the divinity of Jesus. Doesn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. So he could acknowledge, Christianity in terms of the teachings of Jesus, which is what many of the forefathers did, founding fathers did. But in terms of the supernatural aspects of the life of Jesus, they didn't acknowledge it, they didn't believe it. Then there was John Adams. John Adams, I'll tell you, you'd love him here in St. Cloud, because he really had some things to say about the Roman Catholic Church. He says, the question before the human race is whether the God of nature, and that's what the deist God is, the God of nature, shall govern the world by his own laws, or whether the priests and kings shall rule it by fictitious miracles. And, And Kabbalistic Christianity, which is Catholic Christianity, this is John Adams speaking, and which has prevailed for 1,500 years, has received a mortal wound of which the monster must finally die, yet so strong is his constitution that he may endure for centuries before he expires. And a further statement by John Adams, can a free government possibly exist with the Roman Catholic religion? And finally, John Adams says, now he was a Unitarian, a member of the Unitarian Church, but essentially they were deists. And he says, I almost shudder at the thought of alluding to the fatal example of the abuses of grief which the history of mankind has preserved. The cross, consider what calamities that engine of grief has produced. So that was John Adams's viewpoint of the cross and the crucifixion. Now, then came Thomas Jefferson. You'll find because Thomas Jefferson is so prominent in American history, and of course he's the author of the Declaration of Independence, so many Christians will attempt to make Thomas Jefferson appear as a Christian. But the Christians in the day of Thomas Jefferson did not look at Thomas Jefferson as a Christian. When he was up for election, they mobilized all the heaviest artillery they could and threatened Christians with all manner of consequences if they should vote for this infidel. And there was a William Lynn, a Dutch reform minister in New York City, and he had a pamphlet called Serious Considerations on the Election of a President. And he accused Jefferson of not believing in divine revelation and of a design to destroy religion and introduce immorality. You ever heard anything like that before? And he referred to Jefferson as a true infidel and insisted that an infidel like Jefferson could not and should not be elected. So anybody who is trying to suggest that Jefferson was a Christian or looked upon as a Christian in those days, he was nothing anywhere near close to that. And quoting Thomas Jefferson had some magnificent things to say about Christianity. He says, we find the writings of Jesus' biographies, that is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, a groundwork of vulgar ignorance, of things impossible, of superstitions, fanaticisms, and fabrications. Most of you probably heard of the Jefferson Bible. He went through the Jefferson Bible and he eliminated every supernatural event in the life of Jesus. Another place he says, to talk of immaterial existences is to talk of nothings. To say that the human soul, angels, God are immaterial is to say they are nothings, or that there is no God, no angels, no soul. I cannot reason otherwise without plunging into the fathomless abyss of dreams and phantasms. I am satisfied and sufficiently occupied with the things which are, without tormenting or troubling myself about those things which may indeed be, but of which I have no evidence. Another place, Jefferson says, the day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus by the Supreme Being as his Father in the womb of a virgin will be classed as the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter. So take that to your local Roman Catholic friends and priests and see what they say about that. And then with regard to the Trinity, it is too late in the day for men of sincerity to pretend they believe in the Platonic mysticism that three are one and one is three, and yet that the one is not three and the three are not one. But this constitutes the craft, the power, and profits of the priest. Sweep away their gossamer fabrics of fictitious religion, and they will catch no more flies. So that was Thomas Jefferson. I mean, I'm just touching on a few. I mean, he talks about the apocalypse, the book of Revelations. He says it's the ravings of a maniac. And yet, of course, how many Baptists or whatever are always using the book of Revelations to prove this is going to be the coming of Jesus Christ? So I could just rattle off so many other, but I think you kind of get the picture here. After Jefferson became president, he didn't compromise on his beliefs. I wish we could send this to Barack Obama. As president, Jefferson refused to issue Thanksgiving proclamations. The fact that Justice Souter referred to in a concurring opinion in Lee versus Wiseman in a recent Supreme Court decision that ruled prayers at graduation ceremonies are unconstitutional. And in his early presidential term, Jefferson declared his firm belief in the separation of church and state in a letter to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptists, and specifically stating that the legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. The Founding Fathers were very strong on the importance of each person worshiping according to the dictates of their conscience. And they were very much in tune with the idea that if you wanted to believe in Jesus or Zeus or whoever, that was up to you. But there was to be no congressional law establishing any kind of religion. And this just gets me stirred up because we see so many things here today with a Supreme Court where 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices are all Roman Catholic. And of course, in decisions with regard to reproductive rights of women, you've got a Supreme Court that is leaning very strongly, and many state courts around the nation are imposing religious dictates. And it's now even gotten to the point where not only do they want to stop abortion, but they want to stop any kind of birth control. And, a fertilized egg is a human being. And it's gone berserk. It's crazy how this thing has gone. I think one of the most powerful statements that I find is by James Madison. James Madison, 3rd President, author of the Constitution. And James Madison says, during almost 15 centuries of the legal establishment of Christianity, during the 15 centuries of the legal establishment of Christianity has been on trial, what have been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and insolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, and in both, superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Now, if you want to know, there's a pretty strong statement. Lay that on any person who's trying to tell you that the Founding Fathers were Christians. And not only that, but look how he critiques Christianity. Of course, Benjamin Franklin is one of the all-time favorites. He says, I found Christian dogma unintelligible. Early in life, he says, I absented myself from Christian assemblies. If we look back into the history for the character of the present sects in Christianity, we find few that have not, in their turns, been persecutors and complainers of persecution. The primitive Christians thought persecution extremely wrong in the pagans, but practiced it on one another. The first Protestants of the Church of England blamed persecution on the Roman Church, but practiced it upon the Puritans. And these found it wrong in the bishops, but fell into the same practice themselves, both here and in New England. My all-time favorite of these Founding Fathers, and as I said earlier, one that I don't believe begins to get enough credit, is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, his booklet, Common Sense, was responsible for recruiting the army that George Washington was general of. As I understand it, 150,000 copies of this pamphlet went out throughout the United States. And it's that booklet for which he is revered by many as being the father of the American Revolution. Now later on, Thomas Paine wrote another book, which I would really strongly encourage you to get and read. It's called The Age of Reason. And it's a critique of the Bible and of Christianity. Is this camera still on? Okay, good. He says the system of the Christian system of religion, Thomas Paine says, is an outrage on common sense. Another place he says, the story of the redemption will not stand examination. That man should redeem himself from the sin of eating an apple by committing a murder of Jesus Christ is the strangest system of religion ever set up. In another place he says, what is it? The New Testament teaches us to believe that the Almighty committed debauchery with a woman engaged to be married. And the belief of this debauchery is called faith. I mean, think about that, you know. We really need to think about what is faith. I've come to define faith as the ability to look at a square and declare that it's a circle. Because that's essentially what faith is not a virtue. I had faith when I was a little 3-year-old that Santa Claus came down the chimney, and because the glass of milk and cookie on the mantle were not there in the morning, that Santa Claus came. And I can still feel a little sense of hurt when it came to me later on in years when my parents had to explain to me that this was just a joke. So faith is a way of making things up to make it correspond with what you want to believe. Really, it is the epitome of nihilism. It is making things in your own, creating your own worldview regardless of reality. That's what faith really is all about. Faith is not something to be admired. And as Thomas Paine says, belief that a woman engaged to be married, here she is debauched by, actually, you know, if you believe in the Trinity, you believe in the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. They're 3 independent, separate people, but they always act in unity. So, in effect, what we're saying here is that Jesus came and had intercourse with his mother. That's really what it boils down to. It is from the Bible that man has learned cruelty, rapine, and murder for the belief of a cruel God, which makes a cruel man. So that's Paine's view of Christianity and of religion in general. And then going on to say, regarding revealed religion, it is from the Bible that a man has learned, yet this is trash that the church imposes upon the world as the Word of God. This is the collection of lies and contradictions called the Holy Bible. This is the rubbish called revealed religion. And finally, I think the most powerful statement he makes. The study of theology as it stands in Christian churches is the study of nothing. It is founded on nothing. It rests on nothing. It proceeds by no authorities. It has no data. It can demonstrate nothing and admits of no conclusion. Just think about that. But basically what he's saying is that religion is just it's a figment, a creation of man's imagination. That's all it is. It doesn't rest on anything factual. A man you really have to appreciate is an Anglican minister named Reverend Bird Wilson. He was from Albany, New York. And he wrote in the Albany newspaper in something around the 1830s, just a few years removed from the Founding Fathers. Keep in mind the Constitution was 1787. And about this time, I think, Monroe or Jackson was president by then. But he says, he's just a few years removed, and he says, with regard to the Constitutional Convention and the framing of the Constitution, when the war was over and the victory over our enemies won, and the blessings and happiness of liberty and peace were secured, the Constitution was framed and God was neglected. You can just sense his, he's really distressed about this because he's a Christian minister. God was neglected. He was not merely forgotten. He was absolutely voted out of the Constitution. The proceedings as published by Thompson, the secretary or historian of the day, show that the question was gravely debated whether God should be in the Constitution or not. And after a solemn debate, he was deliberately voted out of it. There is no recognition of God's laws and sovereignty. Those who have been called to administer the government have not been men making any public profession of Christianity. The founders of our nation were nearly all infidels, and that of the presidents who had thus far been elected. And he says, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, not one had a professed belief in Orthodox Christianity. Yet they were probably all members of churches. But, you know, when we're talking about Orthodox Christianity, we're talking about the inspiration of the Bible, the virgin birth, and all these supernatural elements. And then at the this is really important, this is really significant. At the Constitutional Convention, Luther Martin, a Maryland representative, urged the inclusion of some kind of recognition of Christianity in the Constitution on the grounds that, and he says, quote, it would be at least decent to hold out some distinction between the professors of Christianity and downright infidelity or paganism. However, the delegates of the convention rejected his proposal. And as the Reverend Bird Wilson stated in his sermon quoted above, drafted the Constitution as a secular document. God was nowhere mentioned in it. And I think one of the most powerful points to consider with regard to the Constitution is in Article 6 of the Constitution. I'm not talking about the Bill of Rights, I'm talking about the Constitution. The Article 6, it specifically states that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Now just consider, could you join the Catholic Church or the Methodist or the Presbyterian or the Baptist without passing a religious test? I mean, in order to join that church, you've got to say, well, I believe in this and this and this and this and this. You've got all these different tests that you have to pass. If you don't say yes to all those things, no way, you're not a member here. So the founders are saying, no religious test. This is as anti-Christian, anti-scriptural as anything you could possibly have. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to public office. And then another point that I think is often overlooked, I'll never forget on public radio one day I was watching Brian Lamb. Most of you have seen Brian Lamb interview different people. And I was very lucky on that particular day. He was interviewing a couple of historians, and they were talking about issues regarding the founding and Christianity and that kind of a thing. And I got on the phone and I got in. Every time I do, every time I make these calls, it's always a busy signal, but this time I got in. And I said, well, how come you haven't mentioned the Treaty of Tripoli? Treaty of Tripoli. The historians, these are PhDs in history, never heard of the Treaty of Tripoli. I said, are you kidding? How can you call yourself, and I said, this is on public radio, you know. How can you call yourself a historian if you've never heard of the Treaty of Tripoli? The Treaty of Tripoli was a treaty, it was negotiated under George Washington's administration, and it was negotiated because the Muslims in northern Africa were attacking American ships and taking Americans prisoners, and so they needed to have a treaty with these people. And so in the Treaty of Tripoli, it is declared, it says, the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Did you hear that? Not in any sense. I mean, how could you get anything more clear than that? Now, I know Christians will say, well, yeah, but they were just doing that because they needed to make a deal with these Muslims, you know. But if you're saying that, you're actually calling the Founding Fathers a liar. And we know George Washington would never tell a lie because, you know, the cherry tree story. But the point is, this was negotiated under George Washington's administration. And, but then when it was brought back for the Senate to approve it, it became under John Adams' administration. And it was passed in the Senate unanimously, not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, and John Adams signed that treaty. Not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. And so he confirmed that treaty. That was in 1797. So the point I think is really interesting to consider is, okay, let's suppose all those framers of the Constitution were members of Christian churches. 50 of 55, according to this list that is found. I don't know how true it is, but let's assume it's true. Assuming it's true, they knew what Christianity was all about, and they didn't put Christianity into the Constitution. They eliminated God from the Constitution. And furthermore, they said there should be no religious test. And then under the Treaty of Tripoli, the nation is not founded on, in any sense, on the Christian religion. And so, for the first 50 years, think about this, the first 7 presidents, beginning with Washington on through Andrew Jackson, not a one of them was a Christian. They were all deists. So if there were so many Christians in that day, you'd think the last thing they'd do would be to be electing, you know, people who were non-Christians. I mean, you think you get elected president, or frankly of any office today, if you don't acknowledge that you're a Christian. And then one other thing that I think is extremely interesting. There's a Christian Legal Society. And the executive director of that Christian Legal Society, which is a society of Christian attorneys. And it's led by a man named Lynn R. Buzzard. And he has admitted that there is little proof to support the claim that the colonial population was overwhelmingly Christian. Not only were a good many of the revolutionary leaders, and I'm quoting him now, more deist than Christian, Buzzard wrote, but the actual number of church members was rather small. Perhaps as few as 5% of the populace were church members in 1776. And then historian Richard Hofstadter says that perhaps as many as 90% of the Americans were unchurched, and goes on to say that mid-18th century America had a smaller proportion of church members than any other nation in Christendom, noting that in 1800 only about 1 of every 15 Americans was a church member. So it seems that, I mean, here we have the acknowledgement of a Christian attorney, head of a Christian legal society, saying there were very few Christians in those days. And in spite of all these declarations of, and I don't understand how it happened, but I mean, you know, the Constitution of the state of Minnesota and the Constitution of just about every state, it talks about God or Almighty God, and a few of them mention Jesus. But as far as the founding of America goes, the founding fathers of America, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, Paine, their views toward Christianity were extraordinarily critical and negative. And as a result, they kept Christianity out of the Constitution. The only leg that the Christian has to stand on that I found, and I don't think it's a very worthwhile point to make, but the Constitution is signed AD, Anno Domini, meaning in the year of our Lord. But everything was, you know, I mean, even today, I sign things AD, you know. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean I agree with the idea that, you know, Jesus is Lord. But it's just a standard thing. But that's the only hint of a belief in a God or a Christian religion that you find anything in the Constitution. So, I want to just recommend a couple of things to you. Besides the Age of Reason, there's a wonderful website called Biblical Nonsense by a Dr. Jason Long. He really goes into Christianity in great depth. He's a doctor, not a medical doctor, he's a chiropractor, I think. But he's got a great little book called Biblical Nonsense and a website that I strongly encourage you to get. And then, of course, you don't want to be without the case for Christ. You've seen this by Lee Strobel. If you ever want to see a lot of softball questions of Christian theologians, I don't know of a better place to go than Lee Strobel. Our friend Earl Doherty wrote a book that was an answer to this. As a matter of fact, I'm the one that got Earl Doherty to write the book, and Doherty just takes this book apart up one side and down the other. An author that I have just come across in the last couple of months that I really, really just think so highly of, his name is Charles Freeman. He's written The Fall of Western Civilization, and he's written this book called AD 381. You've got to read it, because it talks about how the doctrine of the Trinity came to be. And I'll tell you, it's just amazing, because the bishops of the early church had very little to do with the forming of the doctrine of the Trinity. It was argued over and debated over, and many people were persecuted and exiled. But Constantine in the Nicene Council in 325 decided this is going to be the official doctrine of the church. But he had an edict, Constantine had an edict of toleration. But that was 325, but in 381 there was another emperor named Theodosius. And he made it the law of the Roman Empire. And anybody who did not agree with this was labeled as insane and demented. And this is the fruit of monotheistic religion. Because especially when you have, you want church-state unity? Well, here was church-state unity. And if you don't agree with what the president or the Roman Empire says, you're in big trouble. And so Charles Freeman outlines this, and this man has a great insight into Christianity, into the Christian mindset. And it doesn't come across like, I have no idea whether he's atheist, agnostic, deist, I have no idea what he is. I can't believe he's a Christian. But nevertheless, this book he's a great, just I think, extraordinary historian. So, questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Is there no book that directly addresses the topic of your presentation? Do you think there would be?
Yeah, you would.
You're right, folks.
Well, you got a book back there? What's that? Minor Majority?
Yeah, Moral Minority.
Moral.
By, Allen.
Allen. Okay, I've never heard of it. Yeah, I get all this. I just go Google and I put down America Founded Christian Nation. You'll find, at infidels.org, I think it's .org. Is it .org or .com? .org. Infidels.org. There's a Farrell Till, T-I-L-L, Farrell Till. He wrote a great article, and a lot of the things I found here were in his article. And so infidels.org has some articles, and if you just Google it, you'll find lots of different issues. Yeah, Bill.
I think there's one atheist in the Congress.
Yeah, Stark.
And already, Stark.
Yeah.
The only one, right?
He's the only one that was voted.
Yeah, he's very openly. Yeah.
He's the only open atheist in the Congress.
And wouldn't it be great if some congressman got up there in front of the Congress and started reading off these quotes from the Founding Fathers? Oh, jeez. I got to get Al Franken, too. I think Al Franken might just be the kind of guy who would do that.
It was just a thing the other day I saw that from
Herb Silverman, who's an atheist on
Yeah.
the East Coast, but he said that, and he's active with Secular Council or something like that, but he said there are
Secular Coalition.
Secular Coalition.
Yeah.
And he said there are 28 atheists in Congress, but 27 won't admit it.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
I don't know where he got his information, but that was interesting.
Yeah.
And I wanted to mention, I wish I had more details, my memory is shot on that, but either Thomas Jefferson or James Madison wrote the Constitution, or whatever they call it, for the state of Virginia. And there, the separation of church and state that they put is in that, and it was even stronger than what they incorporated in federal.
Another great website with lots of great quotations and all sourced, so you can track them down, is called positiveatheism. I think it's .org. And if you click on quotes, then you can get quotes from, you know, just about anybody and everybody that's ever said anything. And there are a lot of quotes from James Madison. I mean, I've just skimmed over a few of them here, but there's a lot of them.
And it'll organize them by topic. So Thomas Jefferson, religious quotes, or, you know, different quotes that will actually categorize them that way. So if you want all Thomas Jefferson's religious quotes, you just go to that section and it'll give
Right.
all of the
Yep. Yeah. And Thomas Jefferson, he had a library of 7,000 books. You ever been to Monticello? It's a great place to go visit. And you know how, you know, just think, these guys, they had all they could do is read in the daylight and candlelight at night. And of course, they didn't have television, they didn't have the internet, so I mean, that's how they spent their time. And they were extraordinarily well informed, especially Jefferson. He spent, you know, the whole Revolutionary War. He was in France, touring around France, and he collected books, and he was a real scholar, and he could go into great detail on Greek, you know, going back into Aristotle and Plato and numerous philosophers. So these were extremely well-informed people. So. Today is, we live in a day when, you know, everything is so superficial and people just grab anything that comes along. Yeah.
You were talking about your problems with the virgin birth, and I've always felt really sorry for Joseph, who was cuckolded by the Lord.
Yeah. Well, you know, with myth you can get away with just about anything, you know. So, yes.
I was curious if you've heard about the Clergy Project.
No?
It's just been launched. It's a website for clergy that are non-believers but still in the flock.
Oh, really?
And it's a place where they can go anonymously and have a community.
Oh, yeah.
Talk with each other. But they also have veteran clergy that have come out and have gotten out of it. And they're very interested in having those types of people on the website to give guidance to the clergy that are still struggling to get out.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you might be interested in.
Love to know about that. Yeah, I would. I know there's one website called Life After Faith, and that's by a former Baptist minister. Yeah, you know, I often think about, you visualize yourself, you go to Bible school or seminary, and you're well-intentioned and you really want to serve God, and you get into a church, and maybe you can, after a while, you've got this pension fund, you've got your 401k, you've got, and say you're 20 years in the ministry, or 30 years in the ministry, or 50 years old, or whatever, and you get all these reservations about what the Bible really says, and yet, where do you go? I mean, what's a minister going to do if he decides to quit? I mean, for me, in my case, I was fortunate because I had been successful in real estate prior to getting into ministry, and then when I got out, I went back into real estate, and I had some financial independence. But when I think about, some of these Lutheran, Methodist, Baptist preachers, and they know it's false and phony, but they're locked into it.